Let's continue discussing Thomas Sowell's social justice fallacies. This is the second part of the interpretation. In the previous section, we mentioned that different racial performances in the same project are likely naturally occurring. Due to historical reasons or geographical influences, different races may have preferences or aversions to certain tasks. Understanding this, you'll realize that the idea that if opportunities are truly equal, the performances of different races should be the same is a misconception. The reality is that even without racial discrimination, some races may be more inclined to become bankers, while others may prefer basketball. The notion that each race must perform similarly in every field for it to be considered fair is called the equal chances fallacy. Sowell's book specifically devoted such fallacies, and these speculations are particularly advanced. Let me compare it and you will understand. Regarding social justice issues like racial discrimination, people's cognitive levels can be divided into 3 tiers: low, medium, and high. Ordinary people generally just want a quick conclusion. Does contemporary America have racial discrimination or not? If it does, there will be an emotional reaction. The United States is indeed an evil empire. If not, there will be another emotional response. Look at the United States, after all, it's a developed country. Concepts provide emotional value for him, and the source of his concepts may be just 1 or 2 news events or directly someone else's indoctrination. Such concepts, regardless of their correctness, are low-level cognitions. Intellectuals operate at a higher cognitive level, avoiding emotional reactions and advocating for evidence-based judgments. They may argue for or against the existence of racial discrimination in America, providing methodologies for assessment. While seemingly reasonable, the danger lies in this medium-level cognition, as we'll see shortly. Sowell, on the other hand, cannot definitively tell you whether there is racial discrimination in America, or provide you with a method to determine it. However, this is a high-level cognition. Why is that? Because Sowell can ensure that you avoid making major mistakes. Opinions drive actions, making them potentially dangerous. Sometimes having no opinion is better than having a strong one. Low cognition hastily takes sides, medium cognition stands firmly, but only high cognition comprehends the value of having no opinion. Reading Sowell's book is not about adopting a conclusion or taking a stance, but learning high-level cognitive thinking. In this part, let's specifically discuss racial fallacies and appreciate the benefits of high-level cognition. A racial fallacy is a belief that if a race's overall performance is subpar, it's either due to inherent problems within that race, such as inferior genes, or it's because the race faces systemic discrimination. Both of these either-or scenarios are fallacies. About a century ago, in the early 20th century, the mainstream intellectual community in the U.S. believed that black people had lower intelligence. It wasn't baseless. This conclusion was drawn from statistical research. At the time, eugenics was popular, and scholars were keen on comparing the genetic qualities of different populations. The prevalent tests indicated that the average intelligence of black people consistently hovered around 85. Considering that the intelligence test set standard was 100 representing average intelligence, this made black people appear less intelligent. Other evidence, like psychological tests during World War I, showed lower scores for black soldiers compared to white soldiers. So, what was the proposed solution? Some heavyweight scholars, like Yale professor and renowned economist Irving Fisher, suggested segregating or sterilizing black people to protect society. The statistics were not fabricated. They were real. However, looking back, we now see that the judgments at that time were incorrect. As discussed earlier, population differences can be attributed to environmental factors rather than genetic ones. Even at that time, data could have refuted the idea of racial genetic superiority. For example, white populations from isolated mountainous regions scored as low on intelligence tests as black people and possibly even lower. Where people lived had more explanatory power for intelligence differences than genetics. In 1976, a study demonstrated that black orphans raised by white families not only had significantly higher average intelligence than other black children, but also exceeded the national average. A more potent piece of evidence is the Flynn effect, discovered by Professor James R. Flynn. Using a standardized scoring system, he found that the average intelligence of populations worldwide had steadily increased over the past few decades. In the case of Black Americans, if we apply the standards from 1947, their intelligence score in 2002 should have been 104, a noticeable improvement. Even with updated standards, in 2021, the average intelligence of Black Americans reached 91, a clear improvement from the previous 85. If Black people can progress, why claim their genes are inferior, leading to proposals for sterilization? A more reasonable explanation is that the conditions of Black life in the U.S. were unfavorable, not that Black people inherently have inferior genes. Yet, Sowell never explicitly states this, because it's not his primary concern. Sowell is concerned with the fallacious thinking of intellectuals. This fallacy isn't limited to Black people, but extends to the belief that Jewish people, as well as immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, inherently have lower intelligence. Such beliefs persisted despite evidence that, once these groups adapted to the English environment in the U.S., they exhibited intelligence levels higher than the average. Looking back, we might consider the intellectuals of that time foolish. But are today's intellectuals any less foolish? Modern science acknowledges that intelligence does have some genetic factors within a family. However, considering intelligence is not determined by a few genes and tends to regress toward the mean, coupled with significant environmental influence, there's no family where every generation has high or low intelligence. Regarding race, the idea of innate intelligence differences is even less plausible. So, mainstream scholars today don't believe in eugenics. Yet, we still need to explain why the overall situation of Black Americans is generally worse than that of white Americans. Since it's not due to genetic reasons, it must be due to environmental factors. A prevalent modern tendency among scholars is to attribute everything to the legacy of slavery. Why are Black Americans not faring well? Because they face discrimination from white Americans. What's the solution? Compensate Black Americans. Sowell doesn't directly say this perspective is wrong, but he calls it a fallacy. Scholars arrive at this perspective due to flawed thinking, as they oversimplify the issue. For instance, the overall poverty rate among Black Americans is higher than that of white Americans. Can you conclude that Black people face discrimination based on this? No, you need to explain exactly what kind of discrimination leads to such widespread poverty among Black Americans. Upon closer examination, it's discovered that the poverty rate among married Black couples is lower than the national average. If poverty is due to discrimination, why aren't married Black individuals facing discrimination? The real factor influencing overall economic conditions for Black Americans is the prevalence of single-parent households, particularly among Black women. In other words, there are too many unmarried Black women having children. They make up over 60% of all Black women giving birth, a percentage much higher than unmarried white women. If every Black woman ensured she was married before having children, if every Black man responsibly became a father, the average economic situation for Black Americans would surpass that of white Americans. Why are so many unmarried Black women casual about childbirth? Some scholars attribute it to the legacy of slavery, perhaps suggesting that the slave tradition didn't emphasize monogamy, leading to a lack of family values among Black people. But this explanation is also wrong. The reality is that the percentage of single-parent Black families is higher now than in the 1960s. If it were a legacy of slavery, how is it that the problem has worsened despite us being further from the era of slavery? The increase in single-parent households is linked to the expansion of social welfare. Women are more willing to have children now because the government provides subsidies. In some European countries, the expansion of welfare has led to a significant increase in the proportion of unmarried women giving birth, even in the absence of a legacy of slavery. Let's consider another scenario. The rejection rate for housing loans is significantly higher for Black applicants than for white applicants, and Black students are disciplined in schools at a rate 2.5 times that of white students. Can you say Black people are being discriminated against? According to Sowell, you still can't. The simplest method is to bring Asians into the broader comparison. The rejection rate for housing loans is significantly higher for white applicants than for Asians, and white students are disciplined in schools at twice the rate of Asian students. If you want to talk about discrimination, are Asians now the noblest race in America, and are they starting to discriminate against white people? A more compelling piece of evidence is that if the bank CEO is black, the bank is more likely to reject loan applicants who are black. Black teachers have the same frequency of disciplining black students as white teachers. You can't argue that black people discriminate against black people, right? The reality is that the high rejection rate for black people can be explained by their lower average credit scores. There's no mysterious discriminatory factor here. Appreciate Sowell's use of data and evidence. You need to know what data to look for. Similar to the previous section, Sowell presents various evidence to show that many factors other than racial ones can better explain racial differences. Moreover, differences within a race are often more significant than differences between races. For example, among poor black people, students in charter schools outperform those in regular public schools. People living in secluded areas like mountains or hills, regardless of race, tend to have lower overall qualities compared to those in open areas. Considering these many obvious influential factors, scholars focusing solely on racial labels seem short-sighted, don't they? Unexamined beliefs lead to foolish behavior. Former U.S. President Obama once spoke with a young black man who had given up on his dream of becoming a pilot in the Air Force. The young man believed that the Air Force would never allow black people to fly planes, so he abandoned his dream. This is a delusion of persecution. The Air Force doesn't allow black people to fly planes? The U.S. military had an entire squadron of black pilots during World War II. There were 2 black generals in the Air Force. Sowell argues that whoever instilled this belief in the young man did more harm than the racists, as the young man didn't even attempt to strive for his dream. But more significant harm comes from the misguided beliefs of intellectuals. A century ago, intellectuals advocated for sterilizing black people, and today, intellectuals turn race into the dominant label. Yet, these are the same people. They go by the name of progressives. They all want to transform society with their ideologies, thinking they are the drivers of social progress. Sowell is widely regarded as a conservative, leaning towards the belief that society evolving spontaneously is safer, and he opposes radical human interventions. Sowell's trump card is a warning to progressives. You better not mess things up, because you don't understand anything. In the next section, let's talk about intellectuals.
If you feel there is value in this, please like, subscribe to this channel, and leave your thoughts or suggestions in the comments section. Let's grow together and read more good books.